Hello and welcome to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. This week our guest is the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger, to talk about Russia and Ukraine. Remember, we love taking your questions, so write into politicswarroom@gmail.com or send a tweet to @Politicon for next week's show. We'll get to as many as we can. Don't forget to tell us where you're from. And please check out the links to this week's sponsors, Smith.ai, Raycon, and Real Paper. We really thank you. You can check in our show notes, too. We really thank you for supporting these sponsors. It makes this podcast happen. Please tell your friends about us and remind them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, James, so much happening, but one of the big news this week is Stephen Breyer is going to step down pending confirmation of a replacement from the Supreme Court. He has had an incredibly distinguished run on the court. He was a Clinton appointment, an old Ted Kennedy guy. The only thing I disagree with Steve Breyer on, I think, is that the court's not a Republican right-wing court. They seem to be eager to overturn almost any precedent, abortion, affirmative action, and you watch, they're coming after the First Amendment next. But Biden has pledged the first appointment is going to be a black woman, the most frequently cited, who I don't know either one of them, or a woman named Liana Kruger, California judge out there in U.S. Court of Appeals, Judge Landria Brown Jackson. Both, I'm told, are quite distinguished jurists. I'm sure Republicans will oppose them. But I know you want Kamala Harris. I want Sherrilyn Ifill. It's not going to happen. But Steve Breyer, really served his country very well on that high court.
I got to give Paul Begala credit for the Kamala Harris ideas. Put Kamala Harris on the Supreme Court. She was Attorney General of California, so she's obviously qualified, and make Mitch Landrieu vice president. That's not going to happen. One of the things that's happened is, by default, it just became in this country that Supreme Court justices have to be judges before they go to the Supreme Court. And that's just, you can have some, but I would much rather have like a Earl Warren, who was actually a politician that actually had to run for something. And I just think of course, there was no requirement in the Constitution or anything like that. I think we have just lapsed into a position that I just don't agree with. But I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, because it just now, I can't remember the last time you had a Supreme Court justice that wasn't a appellate court or district court or something like that. And I think it's
Sandra Day O'Connor.
Yeah,
that was the last one.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
And you're absolutely right. And anybody who wants to really see that dramatically, go look at our friend George Stevens' two-part series he did 30 years ago in Thurgood Marshall and Brand v. Board of Education. Right. Earl Warren was the politician, Supreme Court Chief Justice, who delivered a 9-0 vote. Now, James, if that had been a 6-3 or 5-4 vote, it would have been graded a lot differently. And we do need that. I don't think it's going to happen this time. I hope it happens sometime soon. Let me tell one quick story about how things have changed. Stephen Breyer was elevated to the Supreme Court from a position on the U.S. Court of Appeals in Boston. How did he get on the U.S. Court of Appeals? 1980, he was nominated, and Congress finished, and it wasn't taken up. Republicans, in a great shock, won control of the Senate. They won the White House. And there was the Breyer nomination hanging out there. Lame duck session. It would have been the Republican, Reagan, and Strom Thurmond, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, their choice. Ted Kennedy went to Thurmond and said, hey, this one really matters to me. And Thurmond allowed Stephen Breyer to be confirmed in a lame duck session. Can you imagine that happening today? No way. Anyway. No way. James, moving on, this is a Carvillian topic, the problems the ultra-left is causing Democrats. One of our other previous guests, a guy we admire a lot, Rudy Chera, has written a devastating critique of how Democrats, who the left is stressing turnout, non-white voters, cultural issues, and everything, and that it just demonstrably doesn't work. He has a great newsletter. He did an interview with Charlie Sykes in the Bulwark, and it's a case that's irrefutable.
Of course it's irrefutable. And the entire theory of the left is not wrong, it's laughable. And their theory, as I understand it, is that BIPOC people, which I think is black, indigenous people of color, all right, all non-Caucasian people will join forces with a part of a white, educated, super liberal group, and we'll win elections like that. Well, that's insane. That's just insane. And first of all, it assumes that anybody, that people are united in their non-whiteness, which is a stupid assumption. And really, he does a great job. And, you know, it's just, I don't even, in some ways that crazy. It's like these people that it's almost like nutty as these anti-science people. I mean, the entire premise of that whole argument is just fundamentally wrong. Fundamentally wrong. And you can't, and Roy points out in his piece, that you can't lose these white working class voters to the extent that Democrats are losing them and win elections. It's just, there's nothing to argue about here, people.
No, there really is not. I called him Rudy. I meant to say Rui,
yeah.
as we know is R-U-Y, and boy, he is good. The only one thing I disagree with him on, he thinks the Democrats made a mistake in trying to do something about this voter suppression. I think that's a much bigger deal than he does, but I agree with him on everything else. And I think Democrats also, they give Republicans a pass on too much. When defund the police becomes part of what seems to be the Democratic agenda, when in fact it's only a teeny % of Democrats. You know, don't give away the crime issue to Republicans. And I think, you know, our friend Terry McAuliffe made a big rhetorical mistake in Virginia on parents in schools. And now you have Glenn Youngkin, the governor, coming in, and he's going to have a secretive little tip room to have people dish dirt on teachers and maybe even book burning. That's an issue. Education should not be an issue where Republicans won on. And I think on your point about the white working class, most of these things they're proposing, the child tax credit, universal pre-K, expanding health care, all that helps white working people every bit as much as it helps black working people. It is not a color issue, and Democrats don't stress that enough.
Of course they don't. And you talk about educational authoritarianism. Look at Glenn Youngkin is doing. Look in Florida, where DeSantis, he's professor from the University of Florida. They're big rivals of ours. I pull against them, but they're a really first-class state university. He said they can't testify. Some judge overruled it,
including our guest Michael McDonald.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, it's unbelievable how a small sliver of Democrats defines our entire party. All right, where their party doesn't get defined by the governor of Virginia or the governor of Florida. You make a very good point. I mean, it's just crazy. That you talk about the illiberal left. The illiberal left. What about the illiberal right? And one other thing is Tucker Carlson was on the air. It never ceases to stun me. He said, "Why are we for Ukraine? What's wrong with Russia? It's just a line on the map." We grew up in a country where people disagreed. We had fundamental issues, but people sort of agreed on the United States. We don't even pull for our own country anymore. This is weird. I want somebody to do a poll and say, assume for the moment that Vladimir Putin could run for president of the United States. In 2024, the candidates were Joe Biden, a Democrat, and Vladimir Putin, a Republican. I would love to see how many votes Putin would get. I bet you he'd come out the chair when you saw it.
Yeah, he'd get Tucker Carlson's and probably more of his followers than we'd like to believe. But Tucker, there, you know, I don't think there's any right-wing authoritarian repressive dictator that Tucker doesn't like. But James, you know, let me stick on this thing just for a minute. Again, we talked about these. You know, let me give you another example. Medicaid expansion. There are 12 states, all run by conservatives, that didn't enlist in Medicaid expansions. In every one of those states, hospitals mainly in rural areas have closed. That is killing an awful lot of rural white Trump voters as well as other people. And Democrats have to stress those kind of issues. You've talked about this. These are districts and areas where Trump got 77% of the vote. If you can cut it to 73 or 74 and you do it in enough places, that makes a big difference. But you can't do it by talking about that left-wing agenda. You can do it by talking about things like Medicaid expansion.
So mark this down. Save it. Listeners, write this down. James Carville says 2 years from now, Mississippi will have a Democratic governor. All right?
Okay.
So there was a big piece, and it was excellent, in the New York Times about, I think it's called Singing River Hospital Group in Pascagoula, Mississippi, which is maybe 45 miles from where I'm sitting right now in South Mississippi. They are overwhelmed. They're losing money hand over foot in these rural hospitals that don't have. It's another $600 million they would have in there. They're losing hospitals everywhere. And Brandon understands this, and he talks about it. And by the way, yes, he is part of that family. And yes, he is the Public Service Commissioner for North Mississippi, is the highest elected state Democrat.
Say his name again, James.
Brandon, maybe you never heard the last name, Presley. And he happens to be from Tupelo, Mississippi. And I think we all
Somebody
know what
else
other
is from
Presley was
Tupelo,
from
right,
Tupelo.
right.
But I mean, he's totally gets it, is the farthest thing in the world from being woke. And he's raising money, and I'm helping him raise money. And, of course, he's 100% for Medicaid expansion. Poor people in Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, I mean, they need this. And not just putting it in rural whites need this. This is insane.
Yes. It is not a color issue by any means, of course. Okay, right here, you have heard it. Brandon Presley is going to be the next governor of Mississippi.
I'm telling you, mark it down. Listeners, mark it down. And when people stop laughing, then follow this race.
All right, James, you're on a roll. So before we go, let's just spend 2 minutes. Last weekend was the best pro football weekend of my life. 4 fabulous games. That Chiefs-Bills game was one for the ages. I'm not sure there has ever been a better game.
And I don't know either. That was something. I have this, of course, and our viewers know how much I love Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. My great fear is that Cincinnati wins and the Rams win, because Aaron Donald and Von Miller, I'm afraid for Joe. He got sacked 9 times and threw for over 300 yards. But then nobody could. Aaron Donald might be the best defensive lineman in the history of the NFL. And we know what Von Miller can do, and we know Cincinnati can't block him. I mean, I really maybe I don't want him to win that much.
I think a more likely test, we may disagree on this, is that Von Miller and Aaron Donald are going to go up against Patrick Mahomes, and he may be a match for them. He is the cleverest, quickest, swiftest quarterback I have ever seen.
And he's got a much better offensive line. I don't think Joe, but it's not an argument. Look, Mahomes is great.
Yeah.
I just say, until, my great fear for Joe Burrow, he's going to get, he got hurt last year. And I mean, the guy has no time at all.
Well, they were, for every game was great. I mean, forever my reservations about the NFL sometimes. Last weekend I was just mesmerized, and I have one complaint: change that damn overtime rule. Games like that should not be decided by a coin flip. They could figure out how to do it, but change it.
Well,
even Andy Reid, the Kansas City coach, said that.
It used to be a field goal, if you remember.
Yeah, that was worse.
Yeah, that was worse. You get 2 first downs and you win the game. I mean, that's how we got to the Super Bowl against Minnesota.
We'll come back next week with our Super Bowl predictions. We're gonna wait though. Okay. Smith.ai handles all calls, after-hours calls, or just your overflow, helping thousands of small businesses across a wide range of industries, including law firms, home service professionals, marketing agencies, and other service-based businesses. And they're ready to help your business too. Imagine work, uninterrupted, running your business with less stress and getting more leads from your marketing efforts. Smith.ai pays for itself. And then some. With all the new clients their receptionists help you win, you'll never miss another lead. You'll boost revenue, increase your focus at work, and keep your staffing costs down. It's as simple as forwarding your calls to Smith.ai. It plan starts at just $240 a month. Try Smith.ai today and see for yourself why business owners like Justine Nicole say Smith.ai receptionists are her secret to business growth and client happiness. I mean, I think even Carville Inc. Would be in for Smith.ai.
But Alex, I've listened to it, and I had one thought in my mind. Why hadn't somebody thought of this before? I mean, you're right. There's tens of thousands of people out there, in businesses, and you miss a phone call or something happens, you lose money hand over foot. And I mean, this makes this make a one-man operation. If I was still in political consulting, I guarantee you, I would sign up for this in a second.
Yeah.
And it just sounds to me on the surface is just a really terrific idea, where you multiply your ability to deal with your customers or clients by tenfold for not very much investment.
And here's to make it even better. Our listeners will save $100 when you sign up using our promo code WARROOM at smith.ai. Visit smith.ai to read 5-star reviews, and be sure to use our code WARROOM, WARROOM, to save $100 at sign up. Don't let another day go by. Try smith.ai or look for the link in our show notes.
And this is a terrific idea. I'm glad that they're part of our show.
Hey, James, with over 100,000 Russian troops poised for a possible invasion of Ukraine, a global crisis, we couldn't have a better guest. Politics War Room favorite, the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, the great David Sanger. David, thank you so much. Let me just start off by asking you, calculate the probabilities of Putin sending in ground forces.
Oh, I think well over 50%. That doesn't mean he'll invade the entire country. He may send them in to expand the areas in the east, the Russian-speaking areas that around Crimea, which, of course, he grabbed in 2014. He might try to take the entire eastern part of the country, sort of up to the Dnieper River, which would basically divide Ukraine in half. I don't think he wants to grab the entire thing and stay, because that would subject him to the kind of insurgency he saw in Afghanistan. They've been there, done that. But I think he'll try to take something.
Well, if he does, let's talk about whether there can be a united NATO response. More buildup of forces, sending more weapons to Kiev, sanctions that really bite, including cutting the Russians off from financial transactions, SWIFT. Are the Germans going to buy into this?
I think the Germans are going to be the most reluctant. Let me give you the sort of the laydown of where we think the allies are in this. So first of all, the most important distinction here is that while NATO helps Ukraine, helps arm Ukraine, helps train Ukraine, Ukraine is not a NATO nation. And part of what Putin is trying to do here is assure that it never becomes one. So he's got a set of Ukraine-related demands, which are Ukraine never joins NATO, and NATO gets out of Ukraine, doesn't supply it with weapons, trainers, so forth. And then he's got a set of broader complaints, which have to do with the expansion of NATO since 1997. And basically, he wants to turn the clock back and, as Fiona Hill put it so wonderfully, evict the United States from Europe. In other words, get all of its nuclear weapons out and make sure we don't have any troops or training going on in former Warsaw Pact nations, former Soviet republics. So your question is, how united are the NATO allies on this? And the answer is they've been surprisingly united, but each one of the major countries that are the biggest voices in NATO is going through a particular transition right now. So in Britain, Boris Johnson is holding on to the prime ministership by a thread and a bad party or two. In Germany, we have a new chancellor, and so there is not the kind of understandable, reliable hand that we got so much from Chancellor Merkel over the past decade and a half. France is entering a presidential election. So if Vladimir Putin was going to pick a moment where he had the most chance of dividing Europe, he's picked it pretty well. And the administration, recognizing that and recognizing the mistakes it made in Afghanistan, has been consulting, drafting documents together with NATO, putting sanctions packages together with NATO. And so it's a real test of wills between the American ability to hold NATO and the rest of Europe together and Putin's ability to divide them.
David, you wrote about some of those possible, I guess you call them off-ramps for negotiations. Ukraine not going into NATO, however they word it, might be the easiest because Ukraine's not going to go into NATO.
Not anytime soon,
in the foreseeable future. But getting NATO, American presence and weapons out of Europe, out of NATO, that's got to be a non-starter from a policy vantage point, and it would be political suicide for Joe Biden, who has to look tough after Afghanistan.
That's absolutely right. And it would also violate a fundamental principle. And we just heard Secretary Tony Blinken, make this point again. He wouldn't say exactly what they put in this document that they sent back to the Russians on Tuesday. But what he did say was that the United States is not surrendering and NATO is not surrendering its open door policy, which basically says you have the right to choose who your allies are and you can apply for membership in NATO. Ukraine would love to be in NATO. NATO would not love to have Ukraine in right now. It's not a mature democracy. It's corrupt. It's got a lot of work to do. But that doesn't mean that they would ever agree with the Russians to cut off that possibility for Ukraine or any other former Soviet state or former member of the Warsaw Pact forever, because forever is a long time. So you're right. Some of these are non-starters. Getting all of our nuclear weapons out of Europe, well, sounds nice because the Russians can say everybody brings nuclear weapons back to their own borders. But Russia is part of Europe, and its nuclear weapons can easily reach European capitals, and even its intermediate ones, in a matter of minutes. So the U.S. is saying, no, we're not going to surrender a position of having all of our nuclear weapons out, although they haven't been moved in some time.
Yeah. James.
So, David, actually, about 15 years ago, I worked in the Ukraine. I worked for the Orange, and the polling was stark. The Eastern, it used to call it the Party of Regions, which was the kind of pro-Russian party. And it was really a stark difference between the East and the Western parts of Ukraine. Some of the stuff I've read is some of the people in the East identify a little more as Ukrainians than before. How much pro-Russian sentiment is there in the East right now, and how much anti-Russian sentiment is in the West? Because I think it's a distinction worth talking about a little bit.
Well, James, I'm glad to hear this because I didn't know this history with you before. And my view is if Ukraine can, survive having Carville working in the country, how bad can an invasion be, right? Now, now this is no laughing matter, I guess. This truly is War and Peace. But jokes aside, what the polling shows is that the country didn't really have a great desire to join the Western alliance prior to Putin grabbing Crimea. But those numbers have now just about doubled. In most of the polling, you see about 60% of Ukrainians are sort of more interested in joining the West. But as you suggest, this is split very much between the western side of the country and the eastern Russian-speaking part of the country. I do think it is fair to say that most of what Putin has done in recent times has served to drive the Ukrainians more toward the West. So he's almost been self-defeating in that regard. And it's also forced a series of governments to seek more arms to defend themselves and to build up their military capability. Last time I was in Ukraine, I remember running into the commander of the American training group that was there. So I think if Putin did invade, he would probably drive even more people to that view, because there's a fair bit of nationalism that has developed in Ukraine about being an independent state, which it has been. We all forget, because it wasn't a big deal in our history, but it was a big deal in theirs, that at the end of the Cold War, Ukraine agreed to give up all of the nuclear weapons on its territory, Soviet nuclear weapons that were there, in return for an assurance from the West that Ukraine's borders and sovereignty would be respected. Now, that did not say that we would come to send in troops on their behalf, but they're going to, if in fact they do get taken over or further taken over, I think they're going to believe that the West left them a little bit high and dry when they swapped their nuclear weapons for what they thought was a security guarantee.
So all the reports that I hear, particularly like a place like Kiev, is people just going on about their lives, and they just it appears that we're more worried about Kiev here than Kiev is worried about Kiev there. Is that a fair inference to draw from this?
Yeah, I have not been there while this is going on, but in talking to my New York Times colleagues who are there, that is exactly right. And the government has been trying to sort of promote that, because their biggest fear is that if there's flight from the city, the economy will collapse, the stock market will tank. So on the one hand, they're saying to the Americans, we need help, we need arms. And on the other hand, they're saying to their own people, don't panic, we've always been under the threat of Russian invasion. As President Zelensky said the other day, what's new? Well, what's new is 100,000 troops across 3 different borders, Russian troops.
So one of the things that was almost everybody, but I was working for the pro-Western Party, obviously, but was an article of faith is Putin hates the idea that the Western part of Ukraine looks toward Poland or Czech Republic or even Germany as kind of models of prosperity, and that Moscow and Putin has always hated that. He doesn't want prosperity on his border where people are going back and forth and say, hey, they got a better deal than we got here. And that drives a lot of his behavior. Do you agree with that sort of general observation?
Yeah, I think that does drive some of his behavior. But, if you go back to this document, the speech that he gave, very long speech in July, he basically said, I don't recognize Ukraine as a separate state. I've never recognized Ukraine as a separate state. It has always been culturally, historically part of Russia and then the Soviet Union. And so he starts from a very different place than we start. We're looking at the map and saying, here's the border, don't you cross it. And he's looking at the map saying, that never should have left Russia in the first place. It only did because Boris Yeltsin struck a bad deal with Bill Clinton and allowed it to drift off to the West. And it's going to be my legacy. Putin's view seems to be that I'm going to begin to undo what Yeltsin did and begin to restore some of those republics. And when you think about it, he now has an ally in Belarus to the north of Ukraine. He just went in and bailed out the government of Kazakhstan. They owe him one. So he can imagine putting an arc together of former Soviet states, not the whole Soviet Union, but the beginning of the rebuilding and the undoing of what he's described as the greatest tragedy in the 20th century.
And before I turn it over to Al, how do the Baltic states look at this? I mean, they got to be nervous.
They are real nervous, and that's why when President Biden authorized those 8,500 troops to go on high alert the other day, he said they would go to the Baltics, which are, of course, or several of them are, members of NATO. And that's the assurance that when the Russians march out, just to make sure they don't turn right instead of heading into Ukraine. So one of the things that Biden has said is that if you take over Ukraine, the United States and NATO will reinforce along the NATO eastern flank, which basically is saying to Putin, not only will we not get out of Europe, we're actually going to add forces to Europe. And that's what worries me about this whole thing. It's not simply the fate of Ukraine, although that is critical, but if they take Ukraine, if we then reinforce on the border, if they then move nuclear weapons, particularly intermediate range, into their new territory in Ukraine, we're back to some of the worst behavior of the Cold War. And, we all thought that was, long gone. Probably, Al Hunt's probably the only one on this entire conversation who even remembers the Cold War, right, James?
I hate to tell you.
How about
I'm not as old now, but I'm close.
Hey, David, how about the Cuban Missile Crisis? You weren't even born
I
back then.
was born by then, but I was very
you were
small.
1 year old,
Yeah.
I think, right? Let me go back to that great Fiona Hill piece in your paper. You earlier mentioned that Putin was figuring this is the perfect time in Europe with a lack of stability. She also says, she calls Putin, I think it's a great term, a master of coercive inducement, that she thinks he also calculates he has us, America, right where he wants us. Weak, polarized, that this is the perfect time to be, that America is his prime target here.
America is certainly the one that he wants to go deal with. And he wants to go deal with them because it's the United States that's the provider of the nuclear weapons that are out there, right? It's the United States that's going to be sort of the key to all of that. So he doesn't really want to deal with Europe, and we want to make sure that we keep the Europeans all in the loop.
Yeah. You also, in one of your terrific pieces this week, made a quick reference to China. Now, Putin and Xi Jinping are trying to make nice and share a wariness about America. Xi Jinping is making a big deal out of those Olympics. Is this a factor? Would Putin conceivably, in order to placate Beijing, postpone anything until after February 20th?
He may well. What's interesting is the Chinese have been really quiet. They haven't said one thing on this, and they're in a hard spot for three reasons. First, they don't want distractions from the Olympics, although I do note that Russia invaded Georgia during the Beijing Summer Olympics, as you may recall, 12, 13 years ago. Second thing to remember out of this is if in fact the sanctions are put in place, China's the one country that might bail Russia out. So he wants to be pretty careful with them. And third, the one who really will settle all the timing of an invasion, if an invasion comes, is the weatherman, because the ground's got to be frozen. And, not many good things come from climate change, but one good thing that's come from climate change is the ground is taking a long time to freeze out there, and the Russians don't want to get all of their heavy equipment bogged down in the mud.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We mentioned earlier I was around for the Cuban Missile crisis. You were still in the crib, but I'm trying to put myself in Putin's mind for a second, and he raised the possibility of putting Russian weapons in Venezuela or Cuba. I suspect that's just a bluff. But if you look back, Kennedy deserves great credit for his handling of the '62 Cuban Missile Crisis. They got the missiles out of Cuba, but Khrushchev got something too. We removed missiles from Turkey.
He sure did.
And is that? Would you guess that might be something that Putin thinks about?
He must. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis is taught in American national strategy classes. I teach it. My colleague Graham Allison at Harvard wrote the single best book about it, Essence of Decision, worth your listeners going back to go for. It's still in print, years and years later. And what did we learn from that? First of all, there was a secret deal that Kennedy used to take missiles out of Turkey. We have a lot of nuclear weapons in Europe that we don't really want in Europe. They're old gravity bombs, and they're hard to defend. Some of them are even in Turkey. So I could imagine a situation where we would negotiate those away in return for a negotiation that pulled back the Russian intermediate or tactical weapons. And Secretary Blinken said today that restoring the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which President Trump pulled out of with some good reason several years ago, was one of the proposals that he's looking at.
David, a final question before I turn back to James. Remember John McCain used to talk about Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country. They have nuclear weapons, and that makes a big difference, I know. But I think much less than China, this is not an awesome economic power. There's probably more dissent inside than Putin wants us to realize. He's jailing everybody in sight. Just as a long-run proposition, I wouldn't want to bet on Russia.
That's right. They are a declining power. And, you could argue that part of what's going on here is that they were feeling like they were being treated like a declining power. That every time you turned on the TV, you heard Joe Biden talking about China. China as the rising military threat to the United States. China as the rising technological competitor. China as the main trade competitor. China as an expanding influence in Latin America, in Africa. And so it's very conceivable that part of what Putin is doing here is throwing what Rose Gottelmeyer, the negotiator of the last big nuclear treaty with Russia, calls a temper tantrum. And that may well be exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and Graham Allison also wrote the great book recently on the U.S. and China.
That's right.
But
we're out. We've got to call Graham when this show is over and tell him that if he sells books because of your guys' podcast, we get our cut.
He's so bashful, though, David. I'm not sure. Yeah. James, go ahead.
David, explain to me and our listeners exactly what the deal is between the Germans and the natural gas and the heating. And it seems to be, I know a little bit about it, but enlighten me some more, that a lot of Germans are saying that's easy for you to say. You got your own energy and you're, 5,000 miles away. But this could, really hurt some of our larger factories and, heating oil or whatever else. But you just go into that just a little bit of the German concerns about this.
So the Germans made a big mistake a few years ago. They began to diminish their use of nuclear power, particularly after the accident a decade ago in Japan. And the result was that they became more and more dependent on Russia. And then along comes the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would take gas directly from Russia to Germany and go around Ukraine. Very deliberate effort by the part of the Russians to cut Ukraine out of not only the pathway, but the revenue that comes from using that pathway. And so that all becomes a piece of this as well. And so the The Germans are quite concerned that if they go along with the sanctions, the first thing the Russians do is make it a very cold winter. And that's why yesterday you saw the administration announce that they were trying to go find alternative sources of supply, liquefied natural gas that you could put on freighters, things like that, other pipelines, diverting shipments that were supposed to go to the United States or to Asia, sending LNG from the United States, anything to say to the European nations, stick with us, we will make sure your people are heated. The question is, can they make that work?
Well, I tell you, it's a really, really complicated problem. How do you think that President Biden is doing so far in this? Do you have any major critiques of to this date the way we handled this?
So far, it's looking pretty good. You know, it could be could be a lot worse.
Right. But the guy said it's jumped out of 40-story buildings. He passed to 20 stories. So far, so good.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No, I mean they've worked. The mistake they made in Afghanistan, which was taking their allies by surprise, they haven't made here. They made sure that every step along the way, the allies were consulted and consulted again and consulted a third time. They're feeling the way we all feel about Zoom meetings. Like, really? Again? I think they've done a good job of that. But the question is, at the end of the day, is it going to save Ukraine? Because we all know, and Vladimir Putin knows, we're not sending troops, and NATO isn't sending troops. So he has sort of what in the strategic world is called escalation dominance, right? He has a way of stepping this up each time. And we have some ways too, but they are mostly soft power and economic power. And he's got hard power and, of course, the cyber power of the ability to once again turn off the power, the electric grid in parts of Ukraine, which he did in 2015 and 2016.
Well, thank you for making that point about nuclear power. I've never gotten this whole anti-nuclear power movement at all, from an environmental standpoint, from everything else, and German engineering is just like France has a lot of nuclear power and they can do it safely. I mean, you're right, but that's a very important point. They led with their chin. Albert.
Well, David, you mentioned cyber, and of course we have the ability to retaliate too to the Russians, to the Russian grid, if they do that. And no one knows cyber more than David Sanger. No one knows any of this stuff more than David Sanger. I think you may even know more than Graham Allison, David.
I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that I think our cyber retaliation here is somewhat limited because. We know that the Russians are through our grid and our systems. They proved that with the SolarWinds attack last year, the ransomware attacks, and so forth. And so we're going to be cautious about going into a direct cyber conflict. We've just got a lot more attack surface for them to attack us than we have for them.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating and I guess volatile, we would say, next 2 or 3 weeks. David Sanger, you, as always, are one of our great guests.
Absolutely.
I can't thank you enough. No one knows more about this subject than you, and so go back to informing us in the New York Times.
And David, thank you so much. You're a great friend of the shows, and I know twice as much now as I did when I started, and I think our listeners are going to feel the same way.
Anytime. I actually love talking to you guys for all the trouble I like to give you both.
We love you giving us trouble.
Still, you're right. Carville in Ukraine, man, just think about it for a while. Hey, James, a lot of people didn't even make resolutions this year. And you know what? I get it. But that doesn't mean you can't shake things up. And whether it's by switching up your workout routine, going someplace new, or taking on another challenge this year, the best way to do it is with a pair of Raycon wireless earbuds in your ear. Raycon wireless earbuds are the best way to bring audio with you because no matter how much you shake things up, literally, no matter how much you shake around, you know they won't fall out of your ears, and their everyday earbuds look, feel, and sound better than ever. They even have an awareness mode for when you need to listen to your surroundings, so you can take Raycons with you wherever you go. And with optimized gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit, these earbuds are so comfortable and they will not budge. Trust us, they're perfect for staying in during your runs, right, James?
Yeah, I can't stand those like teardrop earbuds that just keep falling out of your ear. And, a lot of times I'm, watching something and, I got two things going. And fit is everything. And these people are the king of fit, and plus they can do anything anybody else can do it twice as good. So it really annoys me.
Well, Raycons offer 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life, and they're priced just right. You get quality audio for half and the price of other premium audio brands. It's no wonder Raycon's everyday earbuds have over 48,000 five-star reviews. 48,000. Right now, Politics War Room listeners can get 15% off their Raycon order at buyraycon.com/warroom. That's buyraycon.com/warroom to save 15% off Raycons. Buyraycon.com/warroom or look for the link in our show notes. Hey, James, as always, there are so many good questions. It really is painful to cull them down to 6 or 7, but here we go. Brian in North Hempstead, New York, says, here in November, Democrats suffered local losses they hadn't seen in a generation. Talking up their good policies didn't overcome COVID and Trump exhaustion, allowing Republican retreads and newcomers alike to win narrowly. So how would you go about motivating suburban independents and Democrats to put aside exhaustion and complacency and vote?
Wow. At some point, knowing everything that suburban or traditional Democrats know, if this doesn't motivate you, I don't know I don't know what I can add to it. If 4 years of rampant criminality doesn't motivate you, if you're not motivated by what's getting ready to happen with the Supreme Court, and it's not just Roe, affirmative action is down the tubes. Environmental regulation, forget about it. I mean, they're getting ready to tap dance on your head, and at some point. Biden could do better. We could have better communications. I've got an interview coming up in Vox. We don't concentrate on local races enough. But at some point, we just have to hope and rely that people see and become aware of what's going on around them. Because if you're a Democrat, I mean, we have a 40% drop in the poverty rate. Hourly workers have power that they've never had before, and they will lose all of that and more if they let the Republicans come back in power. And at some point, I hate to say this, but at some point, it's an old expression, God only helps those who help themselves. We got to start helping ourselves here. And we can certainly do a better job of telling people what's at stake, not just what they have to gain, but what they have to lose. But people got to step up and game up. If you can't see this, there's something wrong with you.
I agree. Next, John in Chicago says, what are your thoughts on the latest Supreme Court decision that President Trump cannot use executive privilege to keep evidence from the 1-6 Commission? The only justice to vote against this was Clarence Thomas, whose wife allegedly endorsed the 1-6 rioters. This was an easy decision. It was Trump had no argument, and the fact that one justice voted against it is the only stunning thing. And I would just tell all of our readers out there, if you get a chance, read Jane Mayer's piece in the Current New Yorker on Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, and just see what you think about potential conflicts of interest.
I agree with every word you said, and particularly about Jane's piece. And, I don't understand why senators, Supreme Court justices, federal officials why do they have to trade in stock? And why can't we have people that are appointed that have, and hard for me to disagree with somebody's spouse saying something, but I mean, this is so ridiculous. It's unbelievable. And, of course, if you look at the numbers, people have declining faith in the federal judiciary, and it's no wonder. And, the same thing applies to the Federal Reserve. I mean, every time these guys are like trading stock, I mean, if you're on the Federal Reserve Board, looks like you could give up something for that.
Yeah, I think they're cracking down on that as they ought to, but Congress ought to too.
Yeah.
In a rare misstep, Speaker Pelosi first defended it, but I think she's changing her positions now. There's no, you can be invested in some kind of a mutual fund or something. No one's going to the poorhouse, but you shouldn't be trading on inside information, as I think a number of lawmakers at least have been suspected of doing.
Right.
James, our next question here is this is one I want you to take up. John, in Junction City, California, how is current polling conducted? It used to be phone call to a personal landline. This has changed to electronic communications. What's best now?
I think most of them go to voter list, and obviously, it used to be if you had to have 30% sell in your sample. I mean, now I'm sure these samples 75, 80% sell, because it's a really different characteristic between people. I don't even have a landline. I don't have a phone number other than my cell phone number, and I'm an old guy, so you can imagine that. Young people do, but it used to be random digit dialing. I think they've gone more to voter files, and it's heavily sell. And, it's still some people are more likely to answer the phone than other people. And, polling has always had its problems, its issues. But I think most of the people don't follow the industry, obviously, like I used to. But they're trying to. No one wants to be wrong. I'll put it that way. That's not good for business. But
they do, and having been in working for news organizations that conducted polls, you're absolutely right about the changes. They have a problem. They have a huge rejection rate, much larger than they ever had before, which makes it harder. There's also more and more polls that try to do it than the internet. They aren't there yet, but probably at some point, just as we went from door to door to phone to mobile phone. James, it was 16 years ago. I took my kid to college, and I said, "Well, let's get you a phone." And he said, "What do you mean a phone?" I said, "Well, you got to have a phone in your room." He said, "I have a phone in my pocket."
Right. So, I literally don't have a phone number.
Right.
I'm obviously an older demographic, but I think one day they're going to figure out how to get 10,000 people, a really representative sample, and pay them and do all. I guarantee you, they're trying to figure something like that out.
They are.
They're trying to, and it's
Jackie in Boston Lake, New York, says in major newspapers we consistently read two seemingly contradictory articles. The latest on Trump's crimes, and political journalists and columnists repeatedly talking about Trump's 2024 run with zero reference to his crimes. Are the political journalists just ridiculously siloed, or are they simply assuming that Trump will never be held responsible? Jackie, it's even larger than that. Because you read pieces about the Democratic schisms and problems. Those are real, I can, evade those. They couldn't get a voting rights bill through the Senate. But then you read about Republicans, and you hardly ever read anything about the denial of many of them of the January 6th commission, or wanting to look into that, or those who embrace an absolutely certifiable lie. And I don't think it's bias. I just think it's there's more of the Democrats are in power, but I think Republicans in general are getting away with murder. And every story on Trump running, the second and third paragraph ought to be all the criminal and legal issues he faces.
Well, first of all, this is the first. Back-to-back writers are from places that I never heard of Junction City, California, or Boston Lake, New York. I pride myself on, having a pretty good knowledge of geography of different places around the United States of the world. But congratulations! As soon as I get off here, trust me, I'm going to Google both of them. And but the question is right. And of course, one of the things, my observations being on the outside, you being on the inside, is political journalism tends to have one kind of problem, is everybody talks to the same people. And while that can be valuable, it can also give you some tunnel vision. And it also it's still the old way that journalists grew up. That you're just trained. It was just part of the DNA, that you had. But on the other hand, if the truck runs over a child, you got to interview the truck. Or that I don't know what the analogy is, but it was something like that. And I think that's a ongoing issue that better editors and better news organizations are probably aware of and trying to combat. But I don't know that. And also, I think these investigations, I'll talk about this for 45 seconds. There's just this entire sense with Trump is, and the Mueller thing, and people, they got him, Robert Mueller, boom, 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 boom. And then it just, although it was very damaging, it actually was turned out to be politically a nothing burger, if anything, maybe slightly helpful to rallying the Republican base. And there's just sense that he's been a criminal all his life. He's always gotten away with it, and he'll just continue getting away with it. I would bet that they get him this year. And I mean get him because if they indict him, it's going to be a unbelievably strong case. And can't tell you the merits of in and out of the Manhattan DA or the Westchester DA or the Fulton County DA or the investigation into January the 6th, but something's going to come out of this. It just has to. And the other thing is, Trump just has shitty lawyers, and he always has.
Yeah.
So yeah. I understand how people feel like he just gets away with everything and it's kind of hopeless, but I think this might produce a little different result.
James, you didn't know where those two other locations were. I'm going to solve your problem now. This is from Andrew from a town called New Orleans, Louisiana. And he said that you noted recently Democrats think it's beneath them to sell. You're right, but doesn't that call for a huge shift in the way Democrats approach politics? Don't we need brash populist and anti-establishment fighters rather than beltway elitist?
Well, all right. Yes, of course. And by the way, I'm sure that you feel the same way. The situation in New Orleans, particularly with reference to crime, is just awful. And, the DA and the city council and the police chief, and people are looking for solutions and looking for solutions quickly, and that's everywhere. One of the things is, I'm very big, and I'm not very happy about what's happening in our city right now. But to a large extent, the Democrats are becoming increasingly captive of educated. We just become a very educated party, to the sense that I think we're losing contact with non-coastal educated people. And I people talk about the Democratic establishment. I am often referred to as a member of the Democratic establishment. I have no idea if I am, or how does one become that? Or
do you have your card?
I don't have. I've not been certified. But there's an establishment in everything. I mean, there's some French guy that said that there's 5 people that run any organization. There's 5 people that run the Vatican. There's 5 people that, run General Motors. There's 5 people that run, Angola State Prison. And but in terms of, was Harry Reid an establishment Democrat? I guess, but there's nothing establishment about Senator Reid at all. It's just one of these little. I know what people are getting at. It's one of these words that gets bandied around, and I'm not exactly sure what it means.
Yeah, I think you put that very well. Morgan in Tupelo, Mississippi.
Oh,
Boy,
that's
I tell
right,
you,
Brandon Presley.
we are right around your neck of the woods, James. He said it seems like it's harder these days than ever before to find reliable news and not just noise. Where do you recommend finding reliable, honest news, and what are your favorite sources to read and watch? Number one in my list, this may come as a shock to everybody out there, is the PBS NewsHour, anchored by some woman. I think her name is Judy Woodruff, who I happen to be married to. I also happen to think it is the best show on television. When it comes to reading, Morgan, I read the Times and the Post every day, and I also read the Atlantic is wonderful. The digital Atlantic is terrific, as is the New Yorker. And I am more and more going to various newsletters. Jim Fallows on Substack and Helen Cox Richardson. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on foreign policy. And there's a site, Ian Brenner, it's called G0 Signal Newsletter. I do that. And if I want to find out about healthcare, there's a place called Stat. So the habits are different than they were before. There's a lot of information out there, and some of it's good, a lot of it's not.
Yeah, there's a piece, I could not recommend it more, that is on the Atlantic site by Kurt Anderson, who I think is probably the sharpest observer of American culture that exists. He has a book called Fantasyland. And this is how, talking about COVID, and I remember our friend Don McNeil, who I think is on Substack now, pointed out that actually deaths of Trump voters could make an impact in November. And Kurt goes into how sort of death cults have been, part of history, world history. It's a stunning piece. I agree with you on everything. I am a particular fan of New York Magazine. I love the New Yorker too, because I as you know, I literally no person I find myself more in agreement with than John Chait. But that guy Eric Levitz is very good on that site. I think Ed Kilgore is a wise commentator on American politics. But I like most people, and I find it to be enlightening. For lack of a better term, I tend to gravitate more toward establishment news organizations because I know that they have the resources to really do some interesting stories. And again, I go back to that New York Times story on the Pascagoula Hospital. And that was some stunningly good journalism. I think it can be frustrating. I think they can get things wrong and everything else. But I think you're in the PBS NewsHour. It's just the product is so good. It's the one thing that I actually like. It's very predictable. I mean, there's a very much of a culture on that show. I mean, obviously was on it recently. It's no shouting. There's no interrupting. There's none of that bullshit you get on some of the cable TV channels. So you and I have a really similar view of the news consumption.
And when you go to that New York Times site, just every day look and see if Tom Etzel's there, because anything he writes.
He had a column today. I got to reread it.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to.
Etzel is he's always in the Rui Teixeira piece that we mentioned. I can't recommend that enough, and it's just the kind of thing that our listeners will completely understand.
James, our final question is from John. This is in the Sea Ranch, California, which he says is 3 hours north of San Francisco. Man, that's right close to Oregon.
Yeah,
if you're up there. But he says, isn't it obvious that Mitch McConnell will kill a filibuster in about 10 minutes if Republicans take the Senate and pass laws that will establish fascist Republican rule for generations, laws that will be upheld by this Supreme Court? This is John's question. John goes on to say, therefore, we can't lose 2022.
Well, I don't know where John is. I know that Sea Ranch Lakes is in North San Diego County, but Sea Ranch is...
No, he says it's 3 hours north.
It's probably, again, my guess is it's somewhere close to Eureka, California, but
yeah,
I don't know. you know what they're going to do. They've already done it. They stole the presidential election in 2000. They stole Supreme Court seats. They stormed the Capitol and people are defending them. All right? At some point, we just need a better public. I'm serious. It's just exhausting to see what's going on in this country and to just have people acquiesce to it. And I love doing the show. It gives me a time to vent. But I'm in a particularly venable mood right now because it's just outrageous, the stuff that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I agree. All right, please keep those questions coming. They are great. And if we didn't get to your question this week, send it again for next week because there were far more questions than we could possibly get to. Hey, James, every day, tens of thousands of trees are cut down to make single-use paper products that are flushed or thrown away into our overflowing landfills. That's important because our forests currently remove around 25% of the carbon we put into the atmosphere, making them a crucial part of fighting climate change. Luckily, Real Paper is here to help in that fight. Real Paper is a sustainably made product that helps reduce deforestation and single-use plastic waste. All Real Paper products are 100% plastic-free and made without virgin tree fibers, meaning no trees are cut down to make their toilet paper or paper towels. Real presents a premium, sustainable alternative, so you don't have to sacrifice quality to help the planet. It's a small change with a big impact. So far, Real Paper has eliminated over 250,000 pieces of single-use plastics. 250,000. And each purchase of Real helps fund access to clean sanitation around the world. Now, you can't beat that, James.
You can't. And it sounds like, the more that you think about this, the smarter and better product that it is. The idea, I didn't be particularly graphic about it, but toilet paper usage is around the world is high, to say the least. And, that's how we're going to, if we win this climate fight, we're going to do it, on many different fronts. And, this is an important front. It really is. And it's an indispensable product.
It is. Now, Real Paper is available in easy, hassle-free subscriptions or for one-time purchases on their website, and all orders are conveniently delivered to your door in 100% recyclable, plastic-free packaging. Now, if you head to realpaper.com/warroom and sign up for a subscription using our code WARROOM at checkout, you'll automatically get 30% off your first order. That's realpaper.com/warroom or enter the promo code WARROOM to get 30% off your first order, or look for the link in our show notes. Now it's time for our Outrage of the Week. I'm going to yield to Mr. Carville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hunt. And for our Outrage, our fine producers are going to play a clip that I urge our listeners to listen very closely to.
And Dr. Reiner, you told Barry Weiss essentially she needed to grow up.
Yeah, she needed to grow up because she's acting like a child. When you say you don't want to play this game anymore and you're going to take your ball and go home, you're acting like a child. I like the sacrifices that she enumerated, or that she stripped off her clothes when she got home and then she cleaned the grocery cans. Meanwhile, my colleagues in hospitals all around the country went into care for people dying from this virus. They continue to do that every day. Man our ERs and our ICUs every day. And for the first year of this pandemic, they did that without any protection of a vaccine. That's the sacrifice they made. And all that we've done is ask the public to wear a mask when you go out and about and get vaccinated, right? So I'm glad she's done with it. But I sort of feel like this country has been in a boat that is filled with water, and some of us have been trying to bail the water out of this boat for the last 2 years. And now we have people like Barry Weiss basically saying, I'm done. I'm not bailing the water out anymore. And when
Yeah.
somebody who is relatively young and relatively healthy says that, what they're saying is, I'll be okay if I get this virus. Screw you. Doesn't matter to me what happens to you. That's the message I get from her.
So, as you heard, Dr. Jonathan Reiner, who I happen to know, not very well, but done stuff, he is Dick Cheney's heart doctor. And Dick Cheney's had 6 heart attacks and an artificial heart, and he's 81, just celebrated his 81st birthday. So I'm pretty sure that Dr. Reiner is a highly competent physician and knows what he's talking about. Barry Weiss is a person I actually agree with on some things. She's, kind of really outspoken against extreme wokeness. It's just become, and Bill Maher is a friend of mine. I'm on his show. I agree with Bill on many things, but Barry, there's a certain thing that it's all about me. I'm sick of it. I'm done with it. And Dr. Reiner just points out, because you read that in conjunction with the story about the hospital in Pascagoula, and these nurses are just frizzled at the end of the day. They're being screamed at. They've been called names. They risk themselves. And people dying and families, and and Dr. Reiner, he's a very competent, serious guy, and I thought he just made a brilliant point. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is not you. This is not. It's not all about you. And I'm glad that CNN brought it up, and I was stunningly pleased with Dr. Reiner's response, because I think it reminds us that none of us are the center of this universe.
James, all I can do is join your outrage, because it is so well put. And when you think of all those people, the devotion that those healthcare workers every day, many of whom, have gotten sick themselves, and what they're doing under incredible conditions. And for those who say they're sick of it, I'm sick of them.
Yeah.
So anyway,
shock. This has been such a disappointing the reaction to this on multiple fronts has just been grotesquely disappointing. And you and I talked about this. When this is over and we got to get through it, we need to really look how we organize public health in the United States. I mean, it's a pretty bifurcated system. I don't know, with CDC, the NIH. I think every county in the country has a public health office. Every city has a public, if any substance has public health offices. We got a gazillion schools of public health, and I'm sure they're all good. But the response to this, the guy that wrote the piece in the Times about Japan and their death rate per 100,000 compared to ours, I know it's a different country, it's a different culture, et cetera, et cetera. But this has been a massive, I'd give the American public a C minus, a D plus on this.
Japan is different, but look at Germany too. They're much better, and they're a very similar country anyways. But
by the way, you read and you look at the difference. I mean, these unvaccinated people. I'm just sick of these fucking people.
Any story that talks about hospitalizations or deaths these days and doesn't have in the first 3 paragraphs what the percentage of unvaccinated are is an irresponsible piece of journalism. Yeah. Absolutely it is. Right. And the Washington Post, which I am very high on, had a piece about deaths surging in Maryland yesterday, cases, and I had to read to about the 10th paragraph before I found out that most of these are unvaccinated people. That is relevant.
Irrelevant? Shit, I guess it is relevant.
Anyway,
if anything, the vaccines are they just keep doing well. I mean, it's just time and time again. How can anybody possibly, other than the few, there are some that have legitimate medical reasons. I'm done with these people, man. It's just too goddamn stupid for words. And you're right. I saw that thing in a post, and I read these stories, and Drudge does this. Say, unvaxxed person gets it, and they highlight everything. I think the death rate is like 21 times higher among unvaccinated people, but that's a pretty good number.
Yeah.
Pretty good number.
Sure is. Hey, thanks for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Don't forget to send your questions for us by email to politicswarroom@gmail.com or tweet them for next week's show at Politicon. Following this episode, we'd appreciate it if you'd check out the links to our sponsors, Smith.ai, Raycon, and Real Paper in the show notes. We thank you for supporting them. When you do, it helps make this podcast happen. To keep up with us, subscribe to Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with another show as we continue our War Room planning.